the water would have just torrented down the hill like a tsunami. It must be the shortest lived canal in the whole country, but we're on private land now, so you have to get special permission from the farm to come here.
Ermio Casablanca, how you been? And welcome back to A Thing of the Past. A pleasure as always. Nowadays, the canal might be a nice place to walk the dog from one pub to the next, but in their time, these were the industrial highways of Britain. Between 1790 and 1810, England and Wales experienced a frenzy of construction that led to what was known as Canal Mania. This happened because following the War of Independence in 1783, there were a series of good harvests that meant that people had more capital to invest in business ventures that were not always of personal interest. The idea of the canals was to transport goods to merchant centres, and in Leicestershire, this of course meant good old coal. The fate of these canals, however, was varied, as we shall see today with the Forest Canal that ran from Frankston to Nampanton. We hope you enjoy this episode. As previously mentioned, today we are exploring the remnants of the Charnwood Forest Canal. Built in the late 1700s, the canal linked the coal mines on the Swannington, Culloden and Frankston Commons to Loughborough, where, as well as being distributed locally around the town, it would be taken along the River Line route to Leicester. At both ends of the canal were horse-drawn tramways due to the difficulties encountered when building the canal. At the junction house, close to the village of Osgathorpe, we dive into the story of the Charnwood Forest Canal head first with canal historian Dr Wendy Freer.
Well, Isaac, we're standing here at the so-called junction house. This stood at the junction of two branches of the Charnwood Forest Canal when it came from the collieries at Frankston and the branch that went up to Barrow Hill. So this was a good place to catch boats coming in both directions on their way to Loughborough.
So it was a wide junction down there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There are no locks on this canal. It was a lock-free. It followed the contours of the land.
Okay. And
there's a reason for that. But let me just tell you why the canal was built. Obviously to carry coal, but there's a bit more to it than that.
Okay.
In 1778, the Loughborough navigation opened, followed the next year by the Erywash Canal. And they could bring coal directly from the Nottinghamshire coalfield into Loughborough. So that was a huge advantage for manufacturers in Loughborough. The price of coal for them would have dropped dramatically.
Right.
And so manufacturers in Leicester would look enviously at that and would want the canal to be extended down the River Soar to them.
Okay.
There was a lot of objection to that. The Loughborough navigation objected because they wanted to have the end of the canal in their town. But more than that, the collieries in northwest Leicestershire here in the Colville area, it was a big blow to them because they were still bringing their coal on pack horses.
Okay.
So the first thing they said was, build us a canal. If they've got a canal, we need one. And we need one to bring our coal into Loughborough so that we can compete. Now, before you build a canal, you have to get an Act of Parliament. And when the bill goes forward, there are always objections, always. Millers always object, think it's going to interfere with their water supply.
Yep.
Landowners object, and in this case, the landowners in northwest Leicestershire, the colliery owners, some of them were very wealthy, influential men. Okay. And they owned land on the line of the so-called river line, the one that's going to come from Loughborough to Leicester. And they said, you can't build a canal on our land until you build this one. So the canal company were forced to consider building this canal.
Right.
But the landowners, the colliery owners, they weren't stupid. They knew that once they got the act, the canal company would just
Extend the line. And
just pretend, you know, just dig a few holes here and get on, because this is the line that was going to make them the money.
Yeah.
So the landowners, before they would lift their objections, said, right, you will not open the river line, that's what it was called, until a boatload of coal has come down the Charnwood Forest Canal.
Right, I see.
And that's more or less what happened. The canal, as you see it today, is not on the line that was originally planned. The original plan was for it to follow a natural waterway, the Gracestew Brook and then the Black Brook, which would have been an obvious, sensible way for it to go along a natural valley supplied by natural springs and waterways. Once again, landowners objected, so they had to take up this line, which doesn't follow any natural valley or waterway, spring, brook, nothing. That's why it had to follow the contours of the land, and it was difficult to keep in water. So in 1794, the river line was finished and they were dying to open it because it was going to make money. And this was not finished.
Right.
But there was enough of it for them to put water in and bring a boat down, lightly laden with coal, to fulfil that condition. And then they could just get on with running that canal. This canal wasn't finished in 1794. Officially it was open, but they hadn't built the reservoir. That didn't open until 1796. Now the toll house was here, but this canal was so spectacularly unsuccessful, hardly anybody used it. In 1797, only a year after they'd finished the reservoir, they took the tollkeeper away from here because it just wasn't worth paying a man to sit here and take tolls when there weren't any boats.
Right. So would the tollkeeper have lived here in this house?
Yeah, but not for very long.
So when they hadn't finished the Black Brook Reservoir,
Yeah.
how did they fill the canal to start with? Was it just naturally from rain. or runoff from the
Yes.
fields?
I mean, it wasn't properly filled. They would have, there's no record of what they actually did, but they would have just
By.
just enough water to, and there, I mean there were streams that you could pump water from, just enough to float a boat that had a few lumps of coal in it, literally.
Okay.
So the house as you see it today is obviously in a very poor state, but when they removed the tollkeeper all those years ago, 1797, long time, it was still occupied by farm labourers right up until the 1970s. And in the 1970s and even the 80s, you could still see the house looking pretty much as it always had. It had been extended as well. Originally it wasn't as big as this.
Okay.
We then left for Junction House heading towards Loughborough, where we had arranged to meet local archaeologist Tom, who, with his wealth of knowledge about Gracestew, agreed to show us some of the features of the canal that can still be seen today.
So we're now on our way through Gracestew Woods. We're going to see where a culvert, which is where one stream is directed underneath another waterway. In this case, the Gracestew Brook goes under the Forest Charnwood Canal.
Tom took us into Rusty Mary's field, close to the Gracestew ruins, to show us an old culvert that had been used as a runoff for the canal near to where it passed over Gracestew Brook. Tom hacked away purposefully at the undergrowth with his scythe, whilst I tried to make it look like I was helping out, having left my own scythe at home.
So we're now in Rusty Mary's field, close to Gracestew Priory. Tom has used his chopping tool to cut through the undergrowth to this incredibly hidden tunnel. What we believe this is a runoff from the canal in case it ever flooded. And down from the tunnel you can see where the water has worn away the landscape.
Full of excitement, having seen our first culvert of the day, we rushed back into Gracestew Wood to see if we could find the other side.
So we've just been round to Rusty Mary's field with Tom, and we've seen the runoff drain that would have taken the water if the canal overflowed. This is the other side, and here it's worn away. It looks like it's collapsed. Obviously it's been a long time since it was built.
So whereabouts on the canal are we now then, Wendy?
Well, we've come to a section of the canal which is obviously dry now, but this is where it went in a big loop round the back of Gracestew Priory, a 12th century priory, and then turned pretty much back on itself and went back up almost towards the way that we've just come from the junction house. And if you look at it on the map, you'd probably think, why did they do that? There's no town or village down here. Why come down here? But it's all part of that need to follow the contours of the land, because it's not flat round here. And so they had to make sure that they, as far as possible, kept the canal on the same level. There are one or two places which we may see later on where they've had to build an embankment to keep it on that level and make sure that they never needed any locks.
Okay.
Just beyond here is a small aqueduct. Most people wouldn't even notice it, but it carries the canal over the brook that runs underneath. And then the canal carries on from there. It's for a short distance beyond here, you can hardly make it out. It does run on an embankment round the back of the priory, but that embankment was later taken over by the Charnwood Forest mineral line, the railway, and so the trace of the canal there is pretty much obliterated.
We continued along the canal to the aforementioned aqueduct.
Have you ever been down there before?
Why, do you want to? And you want to see it on that outline there?
That mouth.
Yeah. Where it's cut flat.
So here we are with the Gracestew Brook, with the culvert that takes it underneath the canal. Where Tom's standing here is where the culvert was built out to. The most obvious form of that is the brickwork in the brook, and above that these mounts, that side and up this side, that show how much earth was held up here, and over the years it's been pushed right back now.
As we were about to leave the brook, Tom pointed out something he had never noticed before.
We were just about to climb out of the depths of the Gracestew Brook, with Tom and his keen eye spotted here the clear brickworks at the foundation of the culvert, and in the water here we've got a lovely bit of the foundation, which definitely proves that the culvert ran across this line here.
It was now time to leave the Gracestew section of the canal and head onwards towards Loughborough. Along the way, we stopped to see the only remaining bridge that was built as part of the canal.
Okay, so we've been granted special permission to view this bridge. Wendy, what's so special about the bridge?
It's the only surviving bridge on the canal. There were as many as 15 bridges at one time, and this is the only one still standing, or partly standing. It's known as Thompson's Bridge, but we don't know why. It could have been the name of the farmer, because it didn't carry a lane or a road of any sort, as far as we know. It would have been an accommodation bridge for the farm, so that they could take cattle from one field to another. If you imagine that the canal is cutting straight through here, dividing the farm in two. So it needed a lot of bridges like this for the sake of the farmers. This is the first time I've been able to see it for myself. I've seen photographs, but we're on private land now, so you have to get special permission from the farm to come here. We're very lucky.
Oh, we're pleasure. So Wendy, it's quite a wide bridge here. Was the canal the same width all the way along?
Yes, it would have been pretty much the same width. There's no reason to have it wider or narrower. Canals usually narrow when they go into a lock, but there weren't any locks on this canal. Now, when you look at the width of this bridge, it's not the width of the canal, because don't forget there's a towpath this side. So that's the canal.
Okay.
And the towpath, as we saw from the junction house, was on this side.
And it would have stayed, yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah, so this would have gone all the way, not in a straight line, as you would see, to the junction house. There's a lot of bricks here, as you can see. It was, I mean, I don't know in this particular case, but it was the usual custom to make the bricks on site.
Right. So these would have been made here on the spot?
Or nearby.
Nearby,
yeah.
Wow.
Because there's a lot of suitable clay around that you can dig out and fire.
Very good. Despite the canal falling into disuse all those years ago, this bridge has still survived, which is a tribute to the 18th century workmanship that built it. Having left the bridge, we stop at Blackbrook Reservoir. The original reservoir was built by the navigation company themselves due to a lack of funds. This cost cutting, however, came at a price, as Wendy tells us the harrowing tale of death and destruction that came as a result.
So we're now at the Blackbrook Reservoir, Wendy. What was the significance of the reservoir in relation to the Charnwood Forest Canal?
Well, this is not the original reservoir. The original reservoir was built in 1796, that's when it was finished, 2 years after the canal opened.
Okay.
But it was built to feed water down to the canal because we're much higher up here. Most canals needed feeder reservoirs to keep the water topped up, and the Charnwood Forest Canal was in particular need of topping up with water because it didn't follow a natural valley. So that's what the reservoir was built for, but it was obviously finished in a bit of a hurry.
Lackluster.
Absolutely, yeah, a bit slipshod. And in 1799, the dam failed, and there was this famous disaster. It must have been a terrific sight, one that you wouldn't have wanted to be there at the time. When the dam broke, it said that the reservoir emptied in 11 minutes, and the water would have just torrented down the hill like a tsunami. It swept along the Loughborough Road and along the canal itself. It destroyed the canal, it destroyed a farmhouse, it drowned cattle, it wrecked mills, and it swept all the way into Loughborough. It's said that the Manchester stagecoach was on the Loughborough Road at the time, and they heard it coming. They must have looked back and seen this tsunami coming towards them and galloped. I think the stagecoach is said to have actually galloped into Loughborough, and they stayed ahead of this great wave of water that was coming down the hillside. Considering that the canal was so unsuccessful and had hardly been used at all, it's surprising that the canal company repaired the canal, but they did.
They did, after all of that?
Yeah, and it reopened in 1801, but it was never used again.
Wow. On the walk back to the car, I asked Wendy about one man who is familiar to this channel, whose name had cropped up during my research into the canal. Francis Rawdon, the Earl of Moira.
Moira, his land was on the other side. If you imagine I know it's hard to imagine if you can't see it on a map, but imagine the Leicestershire coalfield. You've got the Western Basin and the Eastern Basin. They're not separate, it's one coalfield.
Yeah.
The Charnwood Forest Canal would have served the Eastern Basin. The Western Basin, they weren't bothered with the Charnwood Forest Canal because they got the Ashby Canal.
Right, yeah.
Which didn't open until 1804 in full. But nevertheless, Charnwood Forest Canal was never going to be of any use to them. So the Earl of Moira...
So he rejected it until he had the Ashby Canal secured? or because he changed his mind, didn't he? Because eventually they did get permission.
I think he was probably persuaded by fellow landowners who wanted the Charnwood Forest Canal, because it really wasn't of any use to the Moira side of the coalfield. But the Earl...
But it wasn't a threat to him. The Charnwood Forest Canal
No.
wouldn't have affected his coal coming out of Moira.
No. He owned land. I think what would have worried him, and actually why he would have objected, not to the Charnwood Forest Canal, he would have been objecting to the river line,
Right.
because that was bringing coal from Nottinghamshire,
Okay.
which was a big threat to the Leicestershire coalfield. So that's where his objections came in. And he owned land, and Ferrers probably did as well, he owned land that the river line was going to go over. So he could hold that up
Right.
until they, and that's exactly what happened. Those landowners held up the building of the river line until the canal company agreed to build a canal for the east
Charnwood.
side. Yeah.
Wow. That's very good.
Yeah.
We then drove from Blackbrook Reservoir back towards the route of the canal bed in search of the best remaining original aqueduct.
The canal would have passed over the top of here,
Okay.
and later the railway. You can see the structure there is more railway looking than canal. But this confuses people a lot, because if they were disorientated, or if they'd never looked in the first place to see where the canal ran, they'd think the canal ran through here. And if we go through and have a look, you'll see these ledges on either side that people think, oh, that must be the towpath, but they're nowhere near big enough for a towpath. And it was always just a way of getting through the embankment.
Okay, so cattle or whatever.
Exactly.
No one is sure of the reason for these raised ledges. However, our cameraman Jack suggested they were maybe for farm workers to walk above the cattle, as they would have been dangerously packed together as they passed through the tunnel, which is a great suggestion. If anyone has any other theories, please post it in the comments. So we've had a nice trek along the old railway line. We've come under the old canal and we've come to this culvert here, Wendy. So what's this here?
Well, what you can see trickling out now is the actual Black Brook. So this is the water that comes down from the reservoir that we've just visited. And as you say, the canal originally was carried over the top on this embankment. And then on it goes. Just beyond here, it sweeps round to the left and onto Shepshed and beyond. But a lot of this embankment, although it was originally built for the canal, it was then built up and strengthened because in the 1880s the Charnwood Forest Mineral Railway came this way as well, and a lot of the railway at this point was built over the top of the canal. So what we're looking at here is not the canal. The canal has been long obliterated by the old railway, which is now gone as well.
Right, and you call this the aqueduct. So
Yeah.
when I think of an aqueduct, I think of a huge structure.
Yes, like a viaduct.
Like a viaduct,
Yeah.
yes, but that is an aqueduct.
Yeah, because an aqueduct is anything that carries something else over a piece of water.
So you can see here, I mean, to build a tunnel through that embankment there, Wendy, I mean, that must have been quite a task.
Well, yes and no, really. The canal builders were building tunnels all over the country, and this would be by no means a new skill by the time they did this.
Right.
Because the much earlier canals in the 1760s, 1770s had needed tunnels.
Okay.
And the Harefield Tunnel, which I think was one of the earliest, is a very long tunnel on the Trent and Mersey Canal. I think when they first built it, they would always start at either end and hope to meet in the middle.
Right.
With regard to this one, though, I don't know what was here before they built the canal, how much of this embankment was built up to keep the canal level.
Right.
Because they couldn't afford to put in locks, so the canal couldn't come downhill or uphill. It had to stay on the same level.
So some of the land around here could have almost been cleared to build the embankment.
It may well have been. There may be, we can't tell from just standing here, it may be that there is a certain amount of rocky structure there anyway. Who knows?
We then left the culvert and headed towards Snell's Nook Lane to see where the canal ended. So this is the towpath?
Yeah.
And the canal ran along
Yeah.
where that building is now?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. As we walked along the former towpath, to our right through the fences, we could see the dip of the former canal at the bottom of people's gardens, many of whom were probably unaware of the lost history that resides just outside their back door. At the end of the footpath, we came out onto Nampanton Road. So here, Wendy, the canal had to end because the descent down this hill was too steep.
Yeah.
And this is where the tramway would have taken the goods onward.
That's right. To take the canal down in this direction would have taken a lot of locks. Expensive to build and even more difficult to maintain water. Every time a boat went through, it would be draining water off the canal.
We then head back into the Jitty from Nampanton Road to check out where Wendy thinks the basin would have been.
The basin is what today would be called a marina, but they didn't call it a marina. A basin is where the boats could turn round, wind in canal terms, and the unloading would take place. Because from here they've got to unload the boat, transship the cargo into the wagons of the horse-drawn tramway, which would be taking it on into Loughborough. And this was the big drawback of the canal, because it didn't go all the way. It didn't go into Loughborough. So, as I say, with the new houses being built here, it's difficult to see exactly where the basin was. You used to be able to see quite a dip round here, and that would have been it. End of the canal.
So really, along the canal, you've got getting the coal out, putting it on the tramway to take it to the start of the canal. So that's one change. Then you've got the canal to here, another change.
Well, that's first of all, you've got to load it onto the tramway at the pit.
Yeah.
Take it to the canal, and there's your second transshipment onto the canal boat. Bring it along here, transship onto this tram road, take it down to the mainline canal, transship again. If it's going to be used in Loughborough, then okay, onto local wagons, but maybe onto canal boats to take it onwards to Leicester and so on and so forth. So that's a lot of transshipments, and they all add to the cost of the coal, and just make it not worth it.
And I read somewhere that would break down the coal into smaller pieces, and at that time, obviously certain industries preferred larger chunks of coal.
The transshipping, you can imagine them, because it would all be done by hand. Shovels. Yeah, that may well have broken down the coal. The canal itself is famous, not just this canal, but any canal, is famous for being ideal for transporting delicate stuff like pottery. That's why the canals were very popular in the potteries, because it was great for that sort of thing. You didn't get the breakages that you get on a horse and cart.
Yeah, I see. That makes sense. Very good. Why is the canal still not here, Wendy?
Why did it fail?
Why did the canal fail?
Spectacularly. It must be the shortest lived canal in the whole country. We've talked about the disaster with the dam. That really finished it, and it was never much used in the first place. So the canal reopened in 1801 when it was repaired after that disaster, but it was never used again. Now, in order to close a canal and abandon it, you have to get another Act of Parliament.
Right.
And local landowners often objected to canals being abandoned because it would mean that they wouldn't be maintained, it may cause flooding on their land, and so it's not such a good idea for them. So when the Canal Company tried to abandon it in about 1808, I think, the bill was opposed and failed, so it wasn't abandoned then, but in reality it was. But officially the Canal Company was still responsible for it. And it wasn't finally abandoned until 1848.
Wow.
And all those years it had been disused, so it would have been in a state. I have a theory that because it took so long to abandon, nobody would have been able to fill it in over those 47, nearly 50 years. It would have been there, and they couldn't fill it in because it hadn't been abandoned. And I think that's why so much of it still exists today, even though it hasn't been used for over 200 years.
Because people adapted to having that as part of their land, as part of their
Yeah,
environment.
it had always been there, so they just got on with it. But the Canal Company, of course, they didn't just own this canal, they owned the Leicester Navigation, and that was a profitable canal. They never wanted this canal in the first place, so they were okay. They continued to be relatively profitable. I mean, you're coming up to the time when railways were starting to put canals out of business.
And did the Leicester Navigation then switch from canals to railways, or was it like navigation companies stuck with the canals to try and keep them going?
It varied all over the country. The Leicester Navigation never became a railway. It was taken over eventually by the Grand Junction Canal, much later. But the Grand Junction Canal, which then became the Grand Union, which is what it's called today, that was a relatively successful canal, and they kept going, albeit under very difficult circumstances, through the 20th century until about the 1970s. There was still some commercial traffic on that line.
Wow.
But like I say, they would be struggling, particularly since the First World War. The First World War did a huge amount of damage to the business on the canals because the government took over and subsidised the railways, but they didn't help the canals. They just left them to their own devices until it was too late. So people think the railways ruined the canals, and certainly, they did a lot of damage to their profits. But a big blow came in the First World War, and then you've got lorries and road transport, and that was the final nail in the coffin. But the canals are still here, and they were revived for leisure use, and we still have a lot of canals that you can still take your boat on.
Very good. Thank you.
Today, there may be many canals around Britain that float your boat, but just as the advances of mechanised engineering and demands of the Industrial Revolution made the canals a possibility and a necessity, the continued advances of these would leave the canals redundant for many years till they found their new purpose in the leisure industry. Sadly, long dried up and integrated into the needs of the surrounding landscape, the Charnwood Forest Canal was not revived for this purpose, and today remains a thing of the past.